I'm Sarah Rosso. I am one of the chairs of the Guilford Central School PTO, and I know most of you. And it's lovely to see your names and faces popping up. Thank you all for joining us. Um, I I am just here to say hi and mostly to listen and learn. But I just wanted to thank you all for coming, and I'm going to pass it on to my friend Becca, who is listed as Sarah Lyons because she's using a colleague's computer. But my friend Becca Mandel is going to facilitate this for us. But this is all Guilford, Dummerston, Brattleboro folks here, and so we are here to talk about public education in Vermont and what we down in southeastern Vermont can do about it. So, Becca, I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. Yes, so I apologize that my name says that I'm Sarah. I'm actually Becca. My incredible colleague is Sarah. But so Sarah Rosso and I have known each other a really long time, and it's really awesome to be doing this work together with you, Sarah. So I'm Becca. I grew up in Middlesex. And I still live here in Middlesex. My kids are now students at Rumney, which is our small community school here. And I went to Rumney, and so it's really fun to see my kids. My mom actually taught also at Rumney, so there's like my kids will still come home, and they'll be like, "Oh, I saw something that says our grandma's name on it in my classroom." You know, it's like her materials are still all over the school, so it's kind of fun to have that connection. But I am the communications person at Public Assets. And so for those of you who may not be familiar with Public Assets, we're a Vermont-based public policy organization, and we have folks all over the state. I'm in Middlesex. My colleague Steph, who's going to be speaking later, is in Chittenden County. We have colleagues in the Upper Valley and the Northeast Kingdom. We don't have anyone who lives in the sort of like the Brattleboro area, but we are sort of all over the state, and we've been doing this work for more than 20 years. And we're sort of a people-driven public policy organization. So we really believe that government should put people before money, that public policies should express our collective values as a state and a community, and that the reason that we work on public education is that public education is the biggest thing that the state of Vermont does. It's the biggest investment we make in our people, in Vermonters, right? And so we want to make sure that we do it in the most equitable way possible, in a way that promotes justice and democracy and the values that we all hold dear as Vermonters. So that's why Public Assets is involved in this kind of work. And we've been doing this sort of ed policy work for a really, really long time. So we are going to hear from a really awesome lineup of folks tonight. And I'm trying to make sure that I don't miss anybody who wants to come in. So it looks like we just have a few more people joining us. So thank you so much for joining us. We're just doing some introductions. We're going to hear from Margaret McLean from the Rural School Community Alliance. We're going to hear from my colleague Steph Yu from Public Assets. And we're going to hear from Nikhil Goyal, who is a sociologist and an author and a former senior policy advisor for Senator Bernie Sanders in the US Senate. So we have a really packed agenda. There's going to be a lot of stuff. There's going to be a lot of time for questions at the end. We have a 7:30 end time, but I know some of us are probably able to stay on a little bit longer if the Q&A goes a little bit after 7:30, but we do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I'm going to turn it over first. And Margaret, this is a quick change to the agenda, sorry, just to mix it up for you. We're going to turn it over to Steph really quickly to do a super quick overview of sort of what the governor's plan is, what's happening in the House, just to like a quick update on where things are and what all of this is. And then we'll turn it back to Margaret to talk about the Rural School Community Alliance and the impact on rural schools. We'll talk to Nikhil about the equity pieces and the healthcare, and then we'll go back to Steph to talk about some of the alternatives for fixing some of these funding issues. So, and then we'll have time for questions. So thank you all so much for being here. And I see that Steph, you cannot unmute yourself. So this is exciting. Zoom, it's so much fun, right? So let me figure out how to ask to unmute. Let's see. Okay. We did, I just want to be clear that we did practice before you all got on. So
Imagine if we hadn't.
yeah, imagine if we hadn't. So Margaret and Nikhil, I'm going to make you co-hosts too. So hopefully this will allow you all to unmute yourselves as needed. And I will run through the slides for everyone, and you can, I'll try to stay on top of running through, but if I'm not doing a great job, poke me and let me know. But Steph, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think I just want to give like a very quick overview of the plans that we're talking about right now, the education transformation plans. I don't know how much you all have been following the news or have been paying attention. I can even give you some up to the minute numbers that came out in House Ways and Means today. So because these things are happening as we speak, so there's a lot of stuff that's changing. I think a lot of people have seen coverage of the governor's plan, and I kind of want to hit the big things about the governor's plan. And then I know Margaret's going to talk about it a little bit, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. But right, so there's a plan forming in the House, there's a plan forming in the Senate. And the governor's plan, I think probably you heard a lot of the big headlines, some of the big picture of which is going to 5 districts. I think a lot that has jumped out at a lot of people. So mega districts, lots of consolidation, which would eliminate the role of local school boards, shift to a part-time paid school board structure. There's also moving to a foundation approach, which basically means that the state decides how much everybody spends per pupil. There's still some weights for different types of pupils, but it's a state decided number, and the governor's number was 13,200 per student. And then they're also sticking with a property tax approach and actually going deeper into a property tax approach and sort of getting rid of income sensitivity. So there's a lot of big changes on the governor's front. And then there's also a lot of, I just want to acknowledge, like, this is less our area. The funding, it tends to be our area, but there's a lot of power moving around in terms of whether it's the State Board of Education. Essentially, the Agency of Education has a lot of the responsibilities that the state board has now under the governor's plan. And the House plan goes along with a lot of the big governance changes, although there also are some key differences, but they're going along with a foundation sort of one size fits all approach. They're starting with a much higher number than the governor, which today the number being debated in Ways and Means, which is not final, was about 15,000 per kid, with also some pretty significant weights for the different categories of pupils. They're also going to consolidation to fewer districts, but they're trying to figure out what those numbers would be. So they're sort of kicking that decision to a working group over the rest of this year that is supposed to come back with 3 possible plans for how to consolidate, with the goal of having districts that are around 4,000 kids, which means about 21 districts statewide. So not as much consolidation as the governor, but still some pretty significant consolidation. One thing I didn't mention is that the governor is expanding, under his plan, there's expansion of vouchers, which the House is not doing. That's an important distinction. The House has a longer timeline for the implementation of this, and there's sort of some conditions that have to be met to implement it. So those are some of the sort of big differences, but also the kind of big governance structures that are proposed to change. And I will also add that the governor has been pretty explicit that the goal is to reduce spending on public education, which the House has not been so explicit about. So, I think that's kind of the big picture. I don't know if Margaret may have more to add to that as she's speaking, or there might be more questions, but I think that's hopefully enough of kind of the big picture overview of where we are. Again, kind of acknowledging that the legislature is still in the midst of thrashing this out. So community voice is really important. And none of this is final. Also, all not only subject to change, but changing by the minute.
Great. Thanks, Steph. I'm going to share my screen, and Margaret, I'll try to advance the slides as we go to match what you were saying. And you can, let's see, unmute yourself, let's see, or
There we go. Good evening, everyone. It's good to see a bunch of names that I recognize, which is great, and a lot of new folks from Southern Vermont. My name's Margaret. I'm from Peacham, and I'm a steering committee member for the Rural School Community Alliance. So first of all, a little bit of background on the Alliance. The Alliance was started in January in anticipation of something big coming along, just prior to the announcement of the governor's plan. 5 school boards came together and formed the Alliance, And then they wrote a letter to a number of other school board members around the state, a total of 350 school board members, mostly of smaller schools, community schools around the state, schools under 250 students. So that was an effort which we didn't know at the time would produce results. And for about a week after sending out the letter on the 15th of January, we didn't hear anything. And then since then, we've had constant contact with people who are interested in finding out more about the Alliance. So the Alliance now represents over 90 entities who have voted to become members. They're primarily school boards, but they're also select boards, parent-teacher groups, one school foundation, and one early childhood group. Actually, the early childhood group from Windham County has joined. So we're at this point, we're at 91 voting entities with representation from all over Vermont. And in your area, quite a lot of Windham County. The only supervisory group in Windham County who is not joined is Windham Southwest. And we are having conversations with them, and in total about 30 other districts that haven't joined that are anticipating perhaps voting in April. So some of them have dates in April to vote, and some of them are still exploring whether this is a good fit for them. The point of the Alliance is to have a voice for rural schools that particularly points out to within the legislature the needs and issues raised by rural schools. So we're a grassroots group, and we have superintendents, we have teachers, we have principals, we have some older students, we have parents and community members and school board members from all around the state. And we're networked in a specific Google group, and we have a platform, a policy platform, which we is a consensus document that tries to present what we believe in a general way, and then in more specifically in relation to the policies that are being proposed. So I want to talk like Steph did about what's happening right now. And I think she's correct to say that we're only part way through. There's still a long way to go, and things could change. But it's important to note that where things stand in relation to rural schools and the policies that are being considered. And there isn't that much daylight between what the governor is proposing and what the Democrats are proposing. It's just slightly different details and slightly different timelines and slightly different scale. But the impact on rural schools would be intense. And so that's what I want mostly to speak to. Both plans end local democratic engagement in school decision-making as we know it. So there would be no more local school boards. You wouldn't elect school board members. Well, you would, but you may just have a sort of partial vote of a partial person who you don't know who'd be on a board that would be far away. The size of these districts are vast. Bigger than like the whole of Windham County would be a district, or even bigger than that in the governor's plan. And in the Democratic plan, it's unknown. It could be 20, it could be less. 4,000 students is a lot. It's twice as big as Windham Southeast is currently. I think Windham Southeast is maybe under 3,000. It's not twice as big, but it's at least a third bigger than you are now. So there's a dramatic break between Vermont's history of local involvement in school decision-making and centralized decision-making with fewer school boards, less local representation, less local decision-making made much further away from the child and what impacts the child and the student. Decision-making far away from that. Many school districts currently have merger articles of agreement, which give a town a voice related to school closures. That was something that was negotiated by groups that chose to merge under Act 46, and many districts were successful in having those articles included. All those articles would be gone within these new districts. Last week, they tried to put in a Section 8 in the bill they're discussing in the House, which would have removed those articles as of July 1st, immediately. Due to pushback from people in the Rural School Community Alliance, they took that out. But it awaits on the side, and it could come back at any point, particularly at the last minute. So it's not something that has disappeared completely. These new districts would not be formed by negotiation between current districts and their neighbors. These districts would be imposed by the state, and there would be no articles of agreement between current districts and the new districts. Neither Republican or Democratic plans currently being considered outline a voice for the Vermonters when it comes to school closure. This is really important for us. Not because communities necessarily would want to just say no, but because we feel that the town that's most impacted by school closure should have a say in that process. We believe that communities need to know the transportation is sorted out, that the children won't be on the bus for hours on end, that what's happening to their teachers? Are they moving to the other school that the children will be going to, or will they be laid off? We feel that communities want to know what's the plan for the building. Is the building going to be empty? Who's going to be responsible for it? What's going to happen so that the building can be affordable now it belongs to the town? We believe that when you close a school, you shouldn't wait and make all these decisions after closure. You should make these decisions and have solid plans prior to closure. Because if you do, then people will be reassured and they may decide that closure is necessary and that they want to close well. The community of Holland up in the Northeast Kingdom closed in 2019, and it made an effort to close well. They took a long time to plan the building and what was going to happen in the building. They now have an Abenaki Cultural Center in part of the building. That's a very lively and special place for people to go. They planned transportation. They made an agreement that all their children would be going to the Derby School and that Derby would provide door-to-door transportation. That relieved people's anxiety about transportation. Their school had dwindled so that there were currently, the year they closed, only 37 students left. And that community made the decision that with 37 students, it was no longer cost effective. It was hard with 37 students to group students well together. And it was unsustainable in their point of view. And so they made good plans and they closed. We acknowledge as an alliance that school closure may be necessary for schools, but we believe that such schools need support. They don't need to be abandoned. They need to be helped to close well so that families, children are reassured through the process and that buildings and all the needs of communities are taken care of prior to closure. And that's why having a vote of the town is a really important piece. Neither of the plans currently addresses geographic isolation. We have a lot of towns that have low population density. You see that in the weights. They weight towns based on population density. And there's a lot of towns that are big square mileage, over 50 square miles, and low population density. So within a current town of that size and that kind of density, it takes a long time to go around with the school bus to pick up children. And currently the children might be on the bus for an hour or more. When you don't have any criteria around geographic isolation, and you close that kind of school. They have an awful long drive around to get to the school, and then they have a drive to the next nearest school. We believe there should be criteria for geographic isolation, and there should be criteria for bus rides. That, you know, a certain age bands, there should be appropriate lengths of bus rides. There are schools that have closed in Vermont, like the Roxbury School last year was closed, whose students are now on the bus for 2 hours and 20 minutes a day. It's a long, bumpy ride, and it's tiring. And many families have chosen to homeschool and not send their children to school, basically to avoid the bus ride. So neither plan currently addresses school closure, addresses geographic isolation, addresses bus rides.
Margaret, I am so sorry.
Too much.
Yes. We are trying to pack so much in. Can we do one quick point and then move to Nicole? I'm sorry.
Okay. Neither plan evaluates past laws like Act 46. Neither plan acknowledges impacts to the communities in terms of depopulation, declining home values, eroding social capital, or problems with attracting families when there's no longer a school. Neither plan estimates transition costs. How much will it cost to get from where we are to this new larger size? Okay. I guess that's all. That's all. That's the current state. It doesn't look good for rural schools, and there's a lot of advocacy needed to improve between now and the end of the session and whatever they decide to pass. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Oops, sorry. All right. So, and I also want to apologize for the willy-nilly advancing and backing forthing of the slides. When I hit my screen to try to unmute myself, it advances the slides. So I'm really sorry about that. So, so next we're going to hear from Nikhil Goyal, who is a sociologist and author and former advisor to the U.S. Senate on policy, healthcare policy, among many other things. So, Nikhil, you should be able to unmute yourself, and I can try to advance your slides for you, and we can see how we do.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. It's a real great pleasure to be speaking with all of you. A bunch of us have been all over the state, whether virtually or in person, for a couple of weeks now, and it's really great to have a chance to speak to all of you about some of these really important issues. So I thought I'd talk about a couple issues at stake here, and maybe start with the first point that a lot of you voted in November for property tax relief, and but you didn't vote for firing thousands of teachers, abolishing democratic school boards, privatizing the public schools, or closing dozens of rural schools. That wasn't on the agenda. And the governor has talked increasingly about ramping up the size of classes and argues that larger class sizes are good for kids. Our class sizes, the data shows, mirrors those of some of the most expensive private schools in the country, where wealthy parents send their kids. Phillips Exeter Academy out in New Hampshire caps class sizes at 12. Sidwell Friends in DC, where President Obama and President Clinton sent their children, has class sizes of 20. If it's good for the president's kids, it's good for low-income and working-class kids right here in Vermont. And the research is universally clear on this. There's no dispute that small classes have a major positive impact on student achievement, reducing gaps across social class and race, improving high school completion and college attendance rates. Across the board, universally a good thing. So that's the first point. The second point is we've been hearing a lot about the cuts and to educational spending. And the reality is that the governor doesn't want to come out and just say that actually when we talk about dramatically reducing per pupil spending, we're going to lay off thousands of teachers. That's essentially what's on the table here. If this plan goes into effect, whether it's the governor's plan or the House plan or some version of it, that means that hundreds and even thousands of teachers and staff are going to be laid off. And I don't know about you, but I didn't vote in November to gut the educational workforce of the state. That was not on the table. And then the school choice piece is really important as well. And that's been kind of coming in and out. It's like the gift that keeps on giving. When we think about the school choice proposal, that is straight out of the Trump playbook. That is, the governor released his plan literally days after Trump signed an executive order instructing the Secretary of Education to prioritize school choice in federal education programs, if there are going to be any left at the end of the day. And this proposal, what it does is force working class families across Vermont to subsidize the private school educations of rich kids. And if you look at Florida, Iowa, Arizona, all these states, the new applicants for voucher schemes were already enrolled in private schools in the first place. So to me, we need to think about a different vision for public education, an agenda for public education that is about equitable school funding that Steph and Becca and folks at Public Assets have detailed in important ways. We've got to talk about how do we invest in the community school model, which is essentially based on the idea that we invest in social and health supports, universal school meals, summer and after school programming, extended day programming, treating schools as the anchor of our communities. We know in our rural communities that the public school is the cornerstone. It's a place where generations of families have had their children educated. It's a meeting place. It's a place where the community discusses the most important issues of the day. It's a place where town meeting is often held. So when we talk about what a vision for public education looks like, to me, a cornerstone of that is the community school approach. And we've done some great work when I worked for Senator Sanders in expanding that model using federal COVID dollars to create community school pilots. We have pilots all over the state, and we've already seen the results in reducing absenteeism, in addressing the health and health challenges that children and families are undergoing. In Newport, they have a family center. They have washer and dryer. They have vans that take kids to dental and health appointments. They have social services integrated within the school so that no child is left behind, no child goes hungry or is not cared for. So I think our job fundamentally has got to be about strengthening our public schools, investing in community schools, and supporting our educators who are working in some of the most difficult conditions. Now, the other piece of this, which is just as crucial, is that we are spending so much time on the education piece and not about what are the biggest drivers of educational costs, and that is healthcare. And there's some important work being done in the Senate Health Committee that has tried to address this issue, but we've got to really focus on that most importantly. Health costs have increased to make up 15% of school budgets and are set to hit 20% within years. Vermonters are paying some of the highest health insurance premiums in the country. Why is that? The reason is we have skyrocketing hospital costs. We have hospitals such as the UVM Medical Center charging patients more than 300% higher prices than that of Medicare. And that's essentially textbook price gouging, corporate greed. There's no reason for that. And so we've got to enact reference-based pricing for the entire system. And the research has shown that we would save hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars if we do that for Vermont patients. And I know the Senate Healthcare Committee has included this proposal in their bill text, and this is something that has to pass. It's a prerequisite to building out a new and more affordable healthcare system. A second piece is capping the salaries and bonuses for healthcare executives. We have healthcare executives in this state, administrators who are making more than $400,000 a year. They're making a killing while patients continue to pay more and more out of their pocket for basic care. They go into debt increasingly for basic operations. And then these health networks like UVM are then cutting back on patient services, cutting dialysis programs and psychiatric units and other essential services. It's unacceptable when they are making huge record profits. If you look at the numbers, hospitals across the state are in the red, but the UVM Medical Center is one of those hospitals that is making a killing, more than $60 million in profits last year. And so in sum, we've got to really think about our healthcare consolidation, how these are essentially corporate monopolies. It's up to the Attorney General to use her power in antitrust enforcement to break up some of these monopolies, to stop these healthcare networks from buying up local physician practices and nursing homes and dialysis wards, and then creating these massive conglomerates. We can't have that. We can't have these massive mergers anymore because patients suffer and prices go up. And then the final thing we need to do is think about how we can invest in community-based care. We have an amazing array of federally qualified health centers which serve hundreds of thousands of Vermonters, a third of the state, and people rely on those services for basic care. We've got to build up those institutions. We've got to get care out of the hospitals for some of these basic procedures and into the community, into mobile dental and vision units and mobile mental health units, and reduce the costs that we're paying on the front end in the hospitals, and distribute that into the communities, into the FQHCs, and into the schools, where are places that we can provide basic care for children and families. And so in sum, there are no silver bullets. There are no panaceas here. There's major reforms that need to be made to this system. And we've got to stop focusing entirely on the schools. The burden cannot be on the backs of children and families to make up these costs. We've got to tackle the healthcare consolidation and corporate greed in that sector. There's a lot that we can be doing here. It's important to call your legislators to make your voices, make sure that your voices are heard. And we got to do it. We got to get property tax relief, but we can do it in a way that strengthens our public schools, not undermines them, supports our educators and staff, not hurts them, and invest in community-based care by taking on the greed and extortionary practices of the healthcare industry. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nikhil. And I think, Steph, we'll just turn it right over to you. And I do know that it's really important to us to leave quite a bit of time for questions. So we'll make sure to do that. Some folks can stay on past the 7:30 mark. Other folks will have to head out, but we'll make sure we have time for questions, and whatever we don't get through here, we're all going to be available to answer questions via email or whatever is necessary. So I want to make sure Steph has a lot of great information to share, so we'll make sure that she gets to share it, and then we'll jump right into questions. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Becca. So as you heard, we've done a number of town halls around the state, and we've been hearing a lot of concerns from parents, students, educators about all of these plans, both from the governor and the legislature. And a whole lot of people are understandably concerned about what these proposals will do, which is take away local control and consolidate power over schools in Montpelier. But we're also concerned about what these proposals won't do. They won't address the most pressing problems facing our schools. What set off this whole conversation last year was concern about school spending and tax bills increasing much more than they had in a long time. But those jumps in many people's taxes last year weren't because of how many school districts we have or who gets to decide how much to spend. Those jumps were really the result of some of these things you've been hearing about from Margaret and Nikhil, which is a perfect storm of cost drivers outside of school districts' control, like the loss of federal ESSER funds and the spikes in the health insurance costs for educators. And the other piece of that perfect storm is the increasing unfairness in how we're paying for schools. Not to mention that there were some unintended consequences from recent state policy changes made by the state recently. So that really impacted what happened in FY25, which is part of why you didn't see such a big jump in FY26, right? So these proposals don't do much to address these core challenges and might make them worse. But it is possible to have property tax relief immediately for your next tax bill without these big changes, without school consolidation, without slashing school budgets. So I want to dig in a little bit more to what we see as the most pressing problems in school funding. So who pays school taxes is unfair in two ways. And this is one of the biggest ways that we see, which is that the richest Vermonters pay a smaller share of their income in school taxes than low and middle income Vermonters. And that's been true for a very long time, but it's also getting worse. The second way in which who pays school taxes unfair is that income sensitivity has gotten out of whack. Maybe a lot of you are familiar with income sensitivity and recognize that basically you get an adjustment, you get to pay your school taxes either based on income or based on property. But the thresholds for that haven't been updated in decades, actual decades, right? In fact, one of the thresholds hasn't been updated since 1985 and the other since 2008. So it's been a really long time, and that leaves low and moderate income Vermonters facing these tax cliffs that can double their bill from one year to the next, even if school spending doesn't change, right? So regardless of the jump in school spending, this can happen to somebody. They get $1 more in income, and all of a sudden their bill jumps because they cross this threshold that hasn't been changed in decades, and that leads to an almost doubling of their bill in a lot of cases. And again, more and more low and moderate income Vermonters are falling into these cliffs because the thresholds have been fixed for so long, even as property values grow. So, and the other piece is, I touched on this briefly with the overview of the plans, but both the governor and House approach is to kind of double down on paying your school taxes with property, making it so not really solving the unfairness in how these work, not really addressing the regressivity or the cliffs. And then there are the cost drivers. So again, those biggest cost drivers, teacher, healthcare, and inflation was a big one. When we look at school spending adjusted for inflation, it's really been flat for the last 2 decades. And then the demand for mental health care for kids and special ed services, both of those things have been growing for a lot of years. But the temporary COVID relief money helped cover that cost. For the last couple of years, now that that's gone, it's really hitting school budgets in full force. But all of these things are squeezing our schools and our kids, and putting some artificial statewide cap on how much schools can spend will only make things worse. Because one of the problems is that these costs hit some districts much harder than others, right? So mental health care is a good example. In some parts of the state, like Chittenden County, we've got access to a lot of mental health care providers, and we can contract with them to provide services to kids. But in more rural parts of the state, there are very few providers. So school districts might have to hire full-time, and in fact they are. We've seen a huge jump in mental health care staff at schools. But those are a much higher cost to the school to deliver those same services. So the cost, not only are the cost drivers out of schools' control, but they're really not distributed evenly across districts. So going to one size fits all doesn't really work as long as those conditions are still true. So until we address the root of these cost drivers, schools are going to have to cover these uneven costs. And so we'll be forced to stay under some artificial cap, and we'll be forced to cut programming in other places. So the plans on the table really aren't solving the problems. But there are a few things we can do this year. We can do this year right away to address property tax relief and make sure that we can raise money fairly for kids. So I want to go to this is sort of how the thresholds work now. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but the big things to note are that $47,000 threshold that's the one that hasn't been changed since 1985. The $90,000 income threshold hasn't been changed since 2008. And those property value thresholds, which determine your income sensitivity and your property tax credit, actually were lowered in 2018 in order to get more taxes out of middle income Vermonters, right? So our proposal is to adjust these thresholds for inflation immediately. It can be done immediately without a lot of work, right? This is just changing these numbers in the system. It doesn't require a lot of legwork. And our suggestion, this is essentially adjusting those numbers for inflation. The property values have been growing pretty fast, so we're talking about moving those up. And again, there's more detail in all these plans. We'll send you links to all this. You don't need to know all the numbers. Just the basic concept is to update these thresholds for inflation, move them with the time since they haven't been moved in a long time. And then the goal is really to move to income-based school taxes permanently for all Vermont residents. This isn't touching property tax, non-residential property taxes, so second homeowners, commercial property, rental. It's not any of that. But right now, the way that it works is that it's cheaper for higher income Vermonters to pay their school taxes based on property value. You get to pay whichever's cheaper. So you pay based on property because it's cheaper than paying based on income. But those of us who are paying based on income, which is 2/3 of Vermonters, everybody under about 125,000 in income, we're paying a much bigger share of our income in school taxes. So you can see the people that are paying based on property have 2/3 of the income. The people with the most income are not paying based on income. They're paying based on property value and get a better deal. So how does that make any sense, right? We're basically relying on low and moderate income Vermonters to subsidize the highest income Vermonters in this system. So we can fix this starting this year. And then on the cost drivers, just Nikhil covered this. So we've got to get serious about healthcare reform. We've got to get serious. It's not a school funding problem. It's a healthcare problem. And it's showing up in our school budgets, but we don't want to take, we're not talking about taking healthcare away from our educators. The other piece is the mental health care system. Again, we can talk about whether to pay for it out of the ed fund or out of the general fund, but that's really not the point. What we're seeing is there's an increasing demand for mental health care. And so we need a robust system one way or another that doesn't leave kids on wait lists for months or waiting in the ER for beds that don't exist. Again, it's not a school funding problem. It's a much bigger problem than that. So, I think we're not saying that's all that needs to be done for public education. I think there's a lot of good conversations happening. Margaret brings up a good point, which is when a school becomes unsustainable, how do you handle it? What does quality education look like? How do we make sure kids get everything that they need, whether that be academic or whether that be a washer and dryer, right? So I think that there's a lot to still explore, but none of the immediate problems and the things that caused the spike in tax bills last year are being addressed by these plans, and none of them necessitate a major overhaul right now. I think Margaret also alluded to this, which is there's been a bunch of big education policy changes at the state level over the last decade or so, and none of them have really lived up to their promises. School consolidation was supposed to save money and improve outcomes. Not sure it did either. Special ed reform was supposed to help more kids and save money. Not sure it did either. And pupil weighting wasn't even really allowed to go fully into effect because it's a big part of what caused the problems in FY25. But that was also supposed to improve outcomes without costing any more money. So the idea that we're kind of going back for more big reforms and when we haven't even evaluated the reforms of the last decade doesn't seem like the best path. So we're not sure why Montpelier thinks that more consolidation, more vouchers, more state control will make things better, or how returning to a one-size-fits-all foundation model that was found unconstitutional back in the 90s because of the disparities it created. We're not sure that going backward 30 years is a good idea. So they're not going to solve our biggest problem. So that's what we're here to talk about. We want to make clear to policymakers that we want good schools, fair taxes, and Vermonters to have a say in both of those things at every step in the process.
All right. Well, thank you, Margaret, Steph, and Nikhil. This is, I hope, really helpful for folks. And we're going to open it up now for questions. And folks can put questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can hopefully unmute you. I mean, we should be able to figure that out, right? This is not our first Zoom. So please, raise your hand, or if you aren't in a place where you can raise your hand, write your question in the chat to me, and I will continue to pretend to be Sarah Lyons, and I will ask your question on your behalf. So, yeah. Does anyone have questions? You're starstruck by the amazing presentations. Diane, is that a thumbs up, or are you raising your hand? I will unmute you. Or you're starstruck. I don't know.
I mean, I will add too, if there aren't questions, we'd love to hear some comments too and thoughts about sort of what people are hearing in their community, how you're feeling about the plans. Are there things that concern you more than others? We'd just love to hear feedback too.
Yeah.
So I'm getting a question. I don't know if we're all seeing this, but from Susie about Act 60 and what did or didn't work with that and moving forward, what we can learn from that. I think it's a really good question. So I think some of the big goals of Act 60 were achieved. And I think there's still room for improvement clearly in our funding system and our public education system. So I'll say that the big goal of Act 60, the two, I think, most transformative elements of Act 60, and I'm sort of conflating Act 60 and 68 because they were sort of part of the same big reform package. But the main thing was that they narrowed the disparity between rich towns and poor towns. They narrowed the spending disparity by more than 30% between rich towns and poor towns. So the spread really shrunk. And that was the main goal. And that's what a lot of states haven't been able to achieve with their foundation formulas. And a lot of the reason that happens with that what happened with the foundation formula in Vermont before 1997 and what still happens in a lot of other states is that there's a foundation formula, which is basically like a base amount that the state guarantees you, but then you can spend whatever you want above the base. So it essentially is a ceiling for poor towns and a floor for rich towns. And that's what we've seen in other states. So there's really these big disparities that it leaves in its wake. So one of the biggest things that happened with Act 60 was that we pooled everything into one big statewide pot. We're one of only 2 states where school taxes are state level taxes. So they're assessed by the state, they're collected by the state, they're distributed by the state. And so what that means is that we're all sort of, it's the collective good for everybody. But I think the biggest significant change sort of in that transition was that we're pooling all of the non-residential resources. We're pooling the residential resources too, but we didn't all used to have access to the non-residential resources. So I think, the classic example is if you're Stowe and you have a ski resort, you got to keep that tax revenue local, and then you didn't have to tax your residents very much because you got that part. Now, all of the non-residential property, again, second homes, commercial property, rental property, all goes into the pot and is shared by everybody. So those are some pretty big leaps forward, I think, with Act 60. What I think was hard for a lot of people is that there's still a fair amount of disparity, right? It narrowed the disparity, but it didn't cure the disparity. So I think that's where a lot of people are feeling stuck. And I think a lot of people are sort of feeling stuck in the way that, while we have local control, that's not equally distributed, right? That some districts are willing to spend more and some districts are struggling and having to cut. And so kids are still seeing a lot of inequality in what they're getting from the schools. So I think that's sort of where there's some interest in kind of making some tweaks. But there's a lot of distance between tweaking what money is guaranteed by the state and what kids should have access to, and taking control of all the resources in the state, deciding exactly how much everybody spends, recognizing that, as Margaret pointed out, that and Nikhil, it's really about school consolidation, closing a bunch of schools, cutting staff, all of the things I think that for the most part people don't want. That was a very long-winded answer, and I am sorry for that.
Thanks, Steph. I see Maggie, your hand is raised, and we have 2 questions in the chat. So I'll do the 2 questions in the chat and we'll go to Maggie. Does that sound good? Okay. So the first one is from Carrie, who asks, how far is the legislature away from moving forward with a plan of their own and or voting on the Scott plan? So sort of like where are we in the process, I think, and what's the timeline looking like? That may be a hard question to answer, but.
Sorry, the question was what's the timeline of making the decisions about these plans?
Yeah, the legislature and the governor's plan and all that sort of stuff.
Well, that's also, yes, it's a squishy question right now. So, there's been a lot of effort for the legislature to get a plan passed this year. They've also been planning to extend the session into June to potentially make that happen, but that's still pretty uncertain. I'll also say that I think the scope of the changes this year, there's debate about the scope, right? Do you do as big a plan as the governor is? Do you make decisions on all of those pieces? Do you just make decisions on some of those pieces? And then the other piece is the timeline of the implementation. I think maybe I said at the beginning that the House's timeline is much longer to implement these things than the governor's. So even once it's implemented, when some of these things go into effect. We're talking FY27, FY28, FY29, before all these pieces would be fully in place. The governor would like a faster transition. So those are, those are some of the sticking points I think that'll have to get decided in the next couple of months.
And then the other question in the chat is about what are the next best steps for citizens that we can advocate for? And I think I'll just flag that at the end, we have a slide with some ideas of next steps. And I think it's getting in touch with your legislators, both your House reps and your senators, and the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. And we have some ideas about what you can sort of share with them. And that will be on a slide and in the materials that we send later. And we can have sort of a bigger conversation about that too. But I just wanted to sort of put a pin in that. And then Margaret, I'm going to try, or Maggie, I'm going to try to unmute you and let's see how we do. Okay. I
think it worked.
It did.
I have two comments, but before, and then a question. But in terms of getting in touch with folks, I know that Notter's on the Senate Education Committee, and then Emily Long, who's pretty local, is on House Education, for those that are going to be getting in touch with people. For work, I was kind of stalking some legislative stuff and ended up on Senate Education. And what struck me in hearing them talk about this is how not well thought through everything is, and how they really haven't considered the unanticipated impacts of this. They were talking about classroom minimum sizes and all of the things that they had not yet taken into consideration, like high school AP classes. You might need to have smaller class sizes to be able to offer those, and class size minimums would make it that high schools would be able to offer less diversity in terms of their course offerings. Really just struck me as like, if that's a major unintended consequence, what other things have they not yet considered? And that was kind of alarming to me, how not well thought out a lot of things were. I will say, in terms of your presentation, I think a lot of it resonates, and the healthcare piece resonates. I do have to say that it feels really different in Southern Vermont to not have UVM Medical Center. We have a small community hospital that I don't see as rolling in dough, and some of the words that were used in terms of hospitals felt pretty inflammatory to me, and not something that I would personally feel comfortable endorsing, because I don't feel that way about our community hospital here in Windham County and in Brattleboro. And so that's just some feedback in terms of, I'm so on board with the message, and I do think healthcare costs are a major driver, but in terms of, judging the intentions of our hospitals, like our community hospital offers a lot of community benefit, and I think that would be unfortunate to feel like that was a part of the message. And then my final question, right, actually not my final question, my question is, I don't really understand how different the non-residential tax rates are, and I feel like there's so many communities, like I do some work with like Athens and Wardsboro, where over 80% of their homes, their residential properties, are second homes, and I don't really understand what the difference is, because I feel like why haven't we explored more what it would look like if there was just one residential tax rate? And it doesn't matter where your primary residence was, but that's a home, so they should be kind of having the same burden as someone who lives here full time. And I'm curious if you all know what the impact would be on shifting residential tax rate to like one standard tax rate.
I'm happy to speak to that a little bit, and I'll actually tell you that there's some talk of going in the other direction. But the basic theory with the division between the residential and the non-residential rate, the non-residential rate is one rate statewide. It's a flat rate across all non-residential categories. The reason that the residential rate moves with your per pupil spending is so that there are tax consequences when you vote on your school budget. So your per pupil spending in your district determines your residential tax rate in your town, because the residents are the ones who get to set that level. Again, a lot of this is in flux. A lot of this could change under a foundation system. And that's part of the question is, if you go to a one size fits all, then you don't necessarily have a statewide equalized rate. It's still complicated by the fact that appraisals happen at different times, property values change at different times. So you'd still have the CLA and some of the confusion around that on the property tax side, even under a foundation system. But what I'll tell you is that one of the things that the House is exploring is actually making more distinctions between different types of property. Because I'll tell you that I think a popular idea is that second homeowners should actually pay more, right? So right now, the way that it works is that the non-residential rate and the average residential rate have to move together, like they have to grow proportionally at the same time. So basically, if the average residential rate goes up 10%, the non-residential rate can only go up 10%, so that you're not, you're not asking the non-residential side to pick up more of the cost. But I think there's some interest in splicing out some of those classifications differently, so that actually you could have differential rates for second homeowners, and potentially differential rates depending on if it's a high value property, a low value property. The commercial rates are often, driven by the size of the business, the amount of revenue on the municipal side. So there's a lot of ways where people want to kind of make more of a differentiation rather than less of a differentiation on that front. Hopefully that's helpful. I know there's another hand up. I'm also getting a couple questions in the chat, so I don't know, Becca, you wanna manage the line here?
Well, I can't see some of those other questions. So, do you want to do a couple questions in the chat and then we'll go, Emma, we see your hands. We'll make sure you have a chance to go after those 2 chat questions. Does that make sense? Steph?
So I'm not sure I understand one of these comments. So if Karen wants to clarify, I think I might have just been talking when she said this, so that what should be the non-residential tax rate? Oh, I'm sorry, you're on mute, but do you want to unmute her? There you go, Lisa.
Which person was it? Sorry, I was
Karen Murphy.
Karen Murphy. Okay, let me see if I knew Karen in my
but then I think
grid here. Okay, let's see.
Rob is also raising a question about why can people spend above a foundation amount, and I think that's a good question. And I will say, the governor's plan basically let people spend above the foundation as much as they wanted, which can create these big disparities. The House plan is trying to manage that a little bit more by limiting how much you could spend above. But part of what's really uncertain about this, and part of what nobody has figured out yet or defined in any of these bills, is if you have these giant districts and you decide to spend above the amount, how does the amount get distributed within the district? So that's a big question that we don't know the answer to. And so that is something that I would keep an eye on, because who gets to decide if you spend more? And then how does it get distributed within these districts if in fact you go to giant districts? And now I think maybe Karen can.
Yeah, Karen, you should be able to speak now.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, as I said, my husband was on the school board here in Wyndham County, Southeast District for 22 years. And he just walked in the door, but at any rate, he's been looking at why our tax rates went so skyrocketing in the last year. And he would say to you, it's about the CLA, because the property selling and what they're appraised at, it just threw everybody under the bus. Because people from other places mostly came up and could afford to buy things that well over the appraised price, and that really skews what your property taxes look like. Also, if you haven't done an appraisal for a while and then do one, you really get hammered. That happened in Putney. Yep. The other thing about non-residential property tax rates, I think you've hit it pretty well. The funny thing is that with non-res tax rates, businesses are included in there too, which doesn't make much sense to me. That people who have non-residential homes, second homes here, for the most part, can afford to be here. And so it feels like they should be able to pay a higher rate.
So I appreciate that. And I think that is part of what they're trying to parse in the House plan, is have second homeowners pay more, and also have the businesses be more about the size of the business than just one flat rate. So I think those are 2 possible improvements or possible things that they're looking into. I will say on your original point, you're right. The so 2 things. The House is looking at a statewide appraisal process, which, there's been efforts over the years to kind of standardize that appraisal process, but have it be a state-based process, be on a standard schedule, so you don't have as much of a long distance between when appraisals happen. But also, moving to income-based school taxes gets rid of all the complexity and frustration and confusion that the property tax side of things causes. Again, that's not touching the non-residential piece, that's just for residents. But that's a big reason, to your point, the CLA can be part of what that disconnect is between what happens to your school budget and what happens to your tax bill. So I think that's part of why we think an income-based system would be much simpler and fairer for folks. And I think it's Emma's turn, right?
Before we jump to Emma stuff, I know I said Emma was going to go next, but I just want to put up the slide with sort of next steps, because we had originally set a 7:30 end time. And so if folks do have to jump, I want to make sure they can see this slide with some next steps. And then Emma will take your question because Steph is able to stay on, and I know other folks are too. So I just want to try to meet everybody's needs, be respectful of everybody's time all at the same time. We'll see how we're doing. I mean, we're doing our best, right? So let me see if I can pull up the correct slide thing. I am a true confession. I am a multiple tabs person on my computer. So I got it. Okay. So let's see if I can actually advance the slide. So in terms of next steps, as Steph was saying, the folks in Montpelier, they need to hear from us now. And I love that there's people on the Senate Education Committee, and that your representative is on the Senate, or your senator is on the Senate Education Committee. So they need to hear from us, and the folks, the chair of House Ways and Means needs to hear from us. So I think, they get a lot of emails, so you can email them, but I also do think that calling them, and then the pages, so I don't know if you've ever done this, but it's really cool. The pages, they bring these little pieces of paper to their representatives and senators with these messages that we bring to them. It's like this charming, like anachronistic thing that happens. So call them, leave them a message tomorrow and say, something along these lines that, we value our public schools. We want to pay for them fairly. We did not ask for this major overhaul of our public education system, but we did ask for targeted help. Like Nikhil was saying earlier, we did ask for targeted help for low and moderate income Vermonters and their property tax bills. We want to put the brakes on this rushed process to make huge changes in public education in Vermont. And we want to move forward with, income-based taxes that are fair for everybody. And we want to fix those cliffs this year. So, I think now is the time, right? We can still have an impact on this process, slow this down, preserve what we value, and make some tweaks to make it work better for us. And there's a lot more information at Vermont VTruralschools.org, which is the coalition that Margaret was talking about, that many of the communities here are part of. Steph and my organization, publicassets.org, has a lot of information on education funding, including some really awesome explainer videos about how ed funding works and how it's worked in the past. And then we have this new coalition website that's publicschoolsvt.org that has a lot more targeted info, some fact sheets that you can download, some action you can take. But I do think, being in touch with the folks in Montpelier tomorrow, give them a call, shoot them an email. I think it's a great thing to do. So maybe I'll leave this up on the screen and we can take Emma's question, and Steph, you can sort of respond. And then if other folks have questions, we can stay on. But Emma, I'm going to try to ask you to unmute. We'll see how we do. I think I did it.
Hi there. This is not Emma. This is Emma's husband, Mike. But you did unmute the right one. And less a question and more just a comment. Yeah, former school board member. I also do educational research. And so, my feeling is that we've asked schools to do more and more over the years. We've asked them to do sports after school, social workers. I think they've really become community hubs, and going in that direction, I think, is really interesting. And so at the same time, I appreciate what Karen was just saying about, it's so much is tied up in property values and income. I also really agree that, rising healthcare costs are a huge issue. As a school board member, I remember getting the budget, a level funded budget, which went up by 11% just because of healthcare costs year over year. That was really hard to swallow, that, either taxes go up or you cut positions because healthcare is going up. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is we're asking schools to do more, and it's also getting more complex, like the taxing around what we're asking people to pay, what an education tax is getting more and more complex. And I feel like increasingly it's just like a misnomer that it is just education. I mean, these are places that are part of our community. And I almost feel like we should change the way we talk about this, because it's not just an education tax. When we think about it as an education tax, then our legislature goes to use the only tool to change the cost in the system, which is changing education. But I think what you're all doing is really so wonderful, which is to say, no, it's not just about education. It's about all these other insane factors that are happening in our state around urbanization and movement and population stagnation, these things. So all that just to say, I really support what you guys are doing, and keep going. And would be great if we can have a more comprehensive conversation about what taxes are used for and how we pay for them and all that. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. And I took the slide down. We'll email all this stuff out to folks with links and additional info, so you don't have to feel like you have to write it all down. This way we can see each other better too. Are there other questions in the chat coming through to you, Steph, or
I don't think so.
other folks who want to have a comment or question?
I just had a little comment. I was struck by what Maggie said about that she didn't see her local community hospital the same way as how Nikhil described the big medical center in Burlington. And I think that's how people relate between their community schools and this sort of big system with big regionalized schools. I think for rural people, having access to a community school, particularly for young children, is what starts them off in the world and connects them. And Maggie's experience about going to that community hospital, I don't know if it's the hospital in Townsend or where it was she was going, I think totally is parallel to the school experience between going to a community elementary school and going to a regionalized elementary school of 450 students, which is what the governor's plan is. And I think this is something that resonates with most Vermonters and that most Vermonters would reject. And we need to make sure the governor knows that.
Thanks, Margaret. And Karen, did your husband, now that he's home, I don't know if you can hear me, Karen, but did he want to add? Oops, I chose a bad moment there talking. Is there anyone else who has a question or Karen, did your husband want to chime in now that he's back from I can unmute you. Hang on, let me get you unmuted. Let's see.
My husband, the school director.
Well, retired,
Recently retired.
but it would be hard for me to jump right in right now. I think a lot of people probably know how I feel, that I think that Governor Scott's proposal is just not practical. I do think something has to be done because of the declining enrollment. I mean, we've gone from 120,000 down to 89 public school students. So I think, and our demographic is so old, I think it's unrealistic to think that things can't change or won't change just because of those two factors. When our kids were in school, there were so many kids, and now they're just, there aren't the numbers. And to try to change that with the demographics that the state has is a real challenge. So, yeah, I don't know. The topography of the state is such a challenge. Like Marlboro, what are they going to do? What Dover's going to do? So, it's a huge challenge. So, but I think that from my perspective, the most positive outcome would be for people to look at the problems, identify the problems in a very specific way, and then somehow work together. The people, the people that want the change and the people that don't want the change, there's got to be a middle ground. So, I mean, I don't personally, the WSESD has put so much in the last, since 2021, so much into infrastructure, that nobody's gonna come along and say, okay, we're gonna close these schools. We've redone all the HVAC, we've redone all the windows, we've redone every heating system. So it would be almost impossible for anybody to come and say, we're gonna make changes, because we've already made the changes. Our district is so well aligned. So
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I mean, I do think, it's been interesting. I think there's a lot of truth in that. And part of the question, I think Margaret said it really well, which is who gets to decide and how do we go about it? We're not saying that everything is sustainable. And I will also acknowledge that I think, we have shrunk a fair amount from where sort of the heyday, and the staff ratios haven't changed much since we had 100,000 plus students. So, that the staff is shrinking as a result of the declining enrollment. We also are seeing per pupil spending. So even when you look at education spending over the last 20 years, it's been pretty flat, adjusted for inflation. What that means, it's about the same share of our state's resources as it always has been. But I think part of the problem is that the tax burden is not in the same place. The tax burden is hitting low and moderate income Vermonters harder, which is part of the problem. But then I also think, to your point, and then there are some schools where, they may be half empty, and what do we do about it? But to Margaret's point, we want that to be a thoughtful process and not a all of a sudden imposed out of nowhere kind of a process. So I think, all this is true. And I hope that I'll say my hope for that to be possible, that we can really, because I don't think we've done a very good job defining the problem, or people are defining the problem so differently that there's not a lot of middle ground. But I think there is room for that. And I think part of how we get there is letting this process take longer and not trying to rush something through in the next 2 months.
yeah, I would agree with that 100%. I mean, I think Scott is digging his heels in. I mean, he says that you're not going to adjourn the legislature until we get an answer for this. And May is right around the corner. So it's unrealistic, totally unrealistic. And I think there are a lot of people pushing him. I mean, I have a good friend who is just outraged by he's got the wherewithal to pay his taxes, but his education taxes have gone up like 30% in the last couple of years. So he says, we got to do something. So I think to listen to people like that is important. And I don't know what the solution is, except I do think that Vermont is sort of the Alps of the United States. So if we took the amount of money that comes into the state every year in terms of skiing expenses, second home expenses, people that have second homes that work full-time in Vermont but don't claim residency in order to get the non-res tax. There are all kinds of areas, like the state of Wyoming pays for all of its education by natural resources. Our natural resources is our tourist industry, but nobody wants to touch that because they think it's going to hurt people, because people won't do it anymore. We're too attractive a state, and we have too many resources for people to give up because they get charged a little bit more for whatever that they come to Vermont as play dates. So play dates, playhouses, I think we can dip into that.
I think that sounds good. Let's see. Thank you so much, Sean. I think we're going to take one more question from Liz and then wrap up, and we'll send resources out to everyone. And thank you so much for coming. But Liz, I'm going to attempt to unmute you. We'll see how I do, and we'll take this one last question.
Hi, I also came late, so apologies if this was already addressed, but it seems that in consolidating schools, they sort of force families' hands into considering private schools, families who wouldn't have considered it otherwise. And my experience having, young children who just got old enough to go into public school and only had the option of private school previously is that the private schools are not performing. They are in the same region in Windham County as the public schools that we now enjoy, are feeling the stresses of behavior and mental health. They are feeling the stresses of hiring, but they have not solved those problems. And what they do is they counsel children out, they underserve children, they exclude children. And by contrast, in the same economy and in the same place, the public schools are performing beautifully. And so while you're making these really well-informed and compelling economic arguments, look at this beautiful case study we have in region by region where you've got a great public school. How are the private schools doing? There's a lot of prejudice, assuming that if you are paying more for a school, it's a higher class school and therefore it's a better education. But the fact is that is not the case. We went to a place that had a 5-star rating that did terribly. Children older than mine who were not performing at grade level. So if you take a close look at what is the alternative, what will we have to work with when these public schools are taken from us, you can see that we're doing a lot more with a lot less in the public schools.
Thanks for that. Well said.
That feels like a really good note to end on, actually. Thank you, Liz, for that. And Margaret did talk a little bit about that, about how, there's much less oversight over private schools, right? So it feels like a good note to end on.